The Palestinian group Hamas says that it's fired more than 130 rockets towards the Israeli city of Tel Aviv and its suburbs. The barrage of rockets followed an Israeli airstrike on an apartment building in Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to intensify attacks on Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza as Palestinians continue to fire rockets from the territory.
Tensions over Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem have stoked daily confrontations. Militants in Gaza launched rocket barrages into Israel for a second day on Tuesday, and Israel planes fired missiles in the Palestinian territory.
We are at the height of a campaign. Since yesterday, the Israeli Defense Forces executed hundreds of attacks on Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza. We targeted the militant commanders. We hit many of the equality targets. At the conclusion of a situational assessment, it was decided that both the might of the attacks and the frequency of the attacks will be increased.
Netanyahu also rejected pressure not to build in Jerusalem.
We also firmly reject the pressures not to build in Jerusalem. To my regret, these pressures have been increasing of late. I say also, to the best of our friends, Jerusalem is Israel's capital. And just as every nation builds in its capital and builds up its capital, we also have the right to build in Jerusalem and to build up in Jerusalem. That is what we have done, and that is what we will continue to do.
Netanyahu said Israel will allow freedom of worship but will not allow violent unrest.
We will not allow extremist elements to disturb the peace in Jerusalem. We will enforce law and order decisively and responsibly. We will continue to ensure freedom of worship to all religions, but we will not allow violent unrest.
East Jerusalem is among territories that Palestinians seek for a future state. US-sponsored statehood negotiations with Israel stalled in 2014. Israel regard all Jerusalem, its capital, a status not recognized abroad.
Of an independent state.
For more on this story, we're now joined via Skype by Nader Hashemi, who's the director at the Center for Middle East Studies at Denver University in Colorado. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. In that clip, we just heard the Israeli Prime Minister saying that Jerusalem is our capital, and like every country in the world, they're allowed to build in their capital. Is this what is at the heart of the current conflict?
Well, I think it touches at what is at the core of this conflict. Recall just a few days ago, there was a major disturbance in Jerusalem that revolved around the eviction of Palestinians from their homes in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, so that Israeli settlers could take over their homes. And so in many ways, this story of the eviction of Palestinians from their homes is not a story that began last week, but really begins at the dawn of this conflict in 1948. When the first Arab-Israeli war took place. So I think this is fundamentally what's perpetuating this conflict. But I want to also highlight the role of the United States, the unconditional support that the United States has given to Israel over the years, both military aid, economic aid, censuring Israel, preventing any condemnation of Israel at international fora, has brought us to this moment. So I think that's fundamentally what's driving this conflict.
Is America in a different position this time around? There seems to be widespread condemnation now about the action that Israel has taken. Might that make it much harder for Joe Biden to try and stay on the sidelines?
Yes, I think things have shifted, but they've shifted in terms of public opinion in the United States. They shifted significantly among American Jews in the United States who no longer support Israel in the same way that they have in the past. So if you talk to people on university campuses, if you look at the intellectual debate, there is deep disgust and a deep desire for a significant change in U.S. foreign policy to be much more equal, much more balanced, and to effectively pressure Israel respect international law and to treat the Palestinians humanely. But at the political level, at the level of politics, at the level of the U.S. Congress, the right-wing hawkish Netanyahu view of the world still reigns supreme here in the United States. And so Joe Biden now is caught in a very difficult position because he campaigned against Donald Trump on a platform of human rights. He said human rights now would be a center of American foreign policy. No longer would the United States support, oppressive regimes in the Middle East. And also internally, Joe Biden, has been very supportive of the grievances of African Americans, sympathizing with the Black Lives Matters movement, and sympathizing with the history of racial injustice in the United States. And when you look at Israel, what you now see is a situation that has been described by Human Rights Watch as apartheid. So Joe Biden now is facing this difficult situation where rhetorically he's been saying these things in favor of human rights, against discrimination, but effectively he's supporting and pursuing a U.S. policy that does the exact opposite when it comes to the Palestinians. So he's in a tough bind.
In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, when I listen to him speaking, it's almost as if he's on another election campaign, taking a very hard line, almost to be seen as being tough.
No, that's correct. If you're following internal Israeli politics, there was recently an election. Benjamin Netanyahu was unable to form a coalition government. The president of Israel has now given the opposition leader the chance to form a government. There could be another Israeli election pending. So this particular escalation of the conflict, the attacks on Gaza, shifting the conversation away from expelling Palestinians from their homes in Jerusalem and focusing on Hamas and their rockets, does benefit politically Benjamin Netanyahu and his current political aspirations. He does face the possibility of a court case related to his abuse of power and his corruption if he were to lose the next election. So there are these political incentives that I think are driving Benjamin Netanyahu, which suggests that this conflict, this escalation in Gaza, is not going to end anytime soon.
So since the attacks on Al-Aqsa, this current round of this conflict has been escalating almost exponentially every single day. How close are we, or do you think it might be likely, if international intervention doesn't come into play, that we might see a full escalation to an intifada, perhaps?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk of another Palestinian uprising or intifada if this conflict escalates. I'm skeptical, largely because, internally the Palestinians have never been more broken, never been more defeated, and critically, never been more abandoned by the world, not just the West, but critically by the leadership in the Arab and Islamic world, comprised mostly of dictatorships and authoritarian regimes who have very little interest in human rights and very little interest in supporting domestic uprisings anywhere in the Arab Islamic world, because they fear that those same uprisings might come back and haunt them within their own countries. But I'd like to highlight one other critical point with respect to the possibility of another intifada and why I'm very skeptical. The Palestinians suffer from very poor, very corrupt, and very oppressive leadership. I'm talking about the Palestine Authority. I'm talking about Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, these people are sort of the epitome of moral bankruptcy when it comes to organizing a movement for national liberation. So when you put all of that together, and then you add on top of it the COVID crisis, and the effects of that on the Palestinian population, I would be very surprised to see if there would be another Palestinian intifada in the coming days or weeks.
So what will happen, do you think? What's the likely scenario that's going to play out? We're seeing 13-story residential buildings collapsing in Gaza. We're seeing rockets landing in Tel Aviv. Something has to give.
In many ways, we've seen this horror show before. If you just take over the last 10 years, There was a major conflict in 2008, 2009, just when President Obama was coming into power. At that time, roughly 1,400 Palestinians were killed, 13 Israelis. If you focus just on the civilian population, in that moment, in that conflict between, Gaza and Israel, the population ratio of deaths were 400 Palestinians on one side, 1 Israeli dead on the other. A few years later, in 2012, another upsurge in conflict, very identical. In 2014, the same thing. In 2018, during the Great March of Return, another upscale in conflict. So this is going to, I think this cycle is going to continue. And the problem with this cycle continuing is that there's really no end in sight. There's no sort of optimism for a peace process or a possible resolution of this conflict, because Israel knows that it has solid backing by the government of the United States, by most members of the U.S. Congress. So there's no incentive for Israel to concede anything. And on the opposite side, with respect to the Palestinians, as I just stated, they are broken, they're defeated, they're humiliated, and sadly, they are being governed by monumentally corrupt leadership. And then, of course, as everyone knows, in the neighboring Arab states, last year, all of them are striking these individual deals with Israel, effectively abandoning the Palestinian cause. And so the Palestinians have, very little regional support. So in that sense, prospects for a somehow just resolution of this conflict, an ending of this cycle of violence, looks incredibly bleak at this moment.
But things have changed in some respects. I mean, over time, more and more territories are being occupied, with more planned on the way. We have the International Criminal Court now wanting to jump into the story. So it's not business as usual in terms of the cycles of violence. Are we perhaps getting to a point where Israel's going to face more pressure than it's ever faced before, that it starts to pull back?
That's a very good point. And I think, yes, in the long term, I think Israel's prospects for continue down this path of oppressing the Palestinians, denying them their basic human and national rights, I think looks very bleak. And I want to draw your listeners' attention to 2 important developments. Last week, Human Rights Watch issued a 213-page, very detailed report that charged Israel with the crime of apartheid. That human rights report echoed an earlier report by the leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, that was titled, and I think it summarizes the report. The title of the B'Tselem report was A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. So what's happening now is global public opinion, American public opinion, American Jewish opinion is slowly turning against Israel. And effectively, the world now is looking at what's happening in Israel, not simply as a question of occupation, of Israel occupying, Palestinian territories in the West Bank, but now they're viewing this conflict through the prism of the crime of apartheid. It's very difficult to justify apartheid when you have mainstream human rights organizations in Israel and in the United States, documenting and discussing the conflict through the exact prism in which the world talked about the conflict in South Africa several decades ago. So from that perspective, I think the hawkish supporters of Israel in the United States are in for some difficult times. And so in that sense, I think there is some chance for a possible just resolution of this conflict. But that's very much down the road, because politically speaking, to talk like I'm talking right now on a mainstream American television station or in the halls of the U.S. Congress would be very difficult to do so. But I think there are changes. You mentioned the International Criminal Court. Israel is very worried about what might happen with an International Criminal Court investigation into its treatment of the Palestinians, which constitute war crimes, possibly crimes against humanity. And Israel is banking that it can forever count on the United States to come to its rescue. But there's also shifts taking place, there as well. In the American Congress, there are these more progressive voices that are now speaking out much more courageously on this question. So I don't think the long-term prognosis looks very good for Israel's hawkish supporters.
All right, and we've run out of time, but perhaps briefly, what about inside Israel? are Israelis starting to get fatigued? Having rockets coming at you endlessly over time, and perhaps starting to hear some of the arguments against what is being done in their name by their government? Or are they still generally taking a hard line that we must defend our state?
Yeah, it's very much the latter. In recent decades, politics has shifted to the right in Israel. I mean, Israel was one of the few countries in the world where the majority of its population supported Donald Trump overwhelmingly. The voices of peace, the voices of a progressive left movement, they have been on the decline. So I don't think these rocket attacks actually are any way going to sort of shape or reorient Israeli public opinion. It's very much, rooted in the direction and in support of the political right in Israel. But I think what can and might shift, Israeli public opinion would be a shift in U.S. policy. If U.S. policy would no longer continue to write blank checks and support Israel unconditionally, that might shake up the internal debate in Israel. But that's very much, a tall order, and there's no indication that we're going to see a shift in U.S. policy toward this conflict anytime soon.
Nader Hashemi, thank you so much indeed for joining us, and your insights greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's Nader Hashemi, who's Director at the Center for Middle East Studies at the Denver University in Colorado, giving us some thoughts on this escalating conflict in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine.